Hello, my name is Susan Van Wyk, Senior Curator of Photography at the NGB. Before we begin today's program, I would like to acknowledge that I'm presenting this talk on the lands of the Bunurong people of the Kulin Nation, and I would like to pay my respects to their ancestors and elders, past and present, and to all First Nations peoples. As we are coming to you remotely today, I'd also like to acknowledge that people present for today's talk may be on the lands of other traditional custodians, and I pay respect to those communities as well. Welcome, and thank you for joining me and my colleague Maggie Finch in a series of talks called Here Comes the New Woman. The series title references Werner Graff's 1929 publication, Here Comes the New Photographer, and the emergence in the 1920s and 30s of the idea of the modern woman. The 1920s and 30s were a revolutionary time in many ways, not just politically. For some women, particularly in Europe, but also in North America, Australia, Japan and China, among other places, it was a moment when it was possible for women to transgress the boundaries and roles historically deemed suitable for them. Women were able to redefine their identity through how they socialised, what they wore, what kind of work they undertook. The term New Woman was coined at this time to describe this modern 20th century female. The opening up of employment opportunities for women that occurred during World War I was maintained in some, but certainly not all fields. Notably, photography continued to offer women the prospect for financial independence and creative expression, and some of the most significant photographers of the interwar period were women. Institutionally, art galleries around the world have for too long overlooked the work of women artists. And the role of women photographers has historically not received the recognition that it is due. Although I'm pleased to be able to say that this is changing through the groundbreaking work of historians, writers and curators globally. It's an ongoing priority for the NGV to address the historical gender bias across all collecting areas, and in the photography collection, one of our areas of focused acquisition is the work of women photographers who were active in the first half of the 20th century. Today I'm going to be sharing images made by two women photographers who were active in America in the 1930s and who were also contributors to a remarkable government-funded and directed archival project. So some background. The 1930s in the United States was a decade dominated by hardship for much of the population. The combined effects of the 1929 stock market crash and a prolonged period of drought and mismanagement of marginal agricultural lands led to what was known as the Great Depression. Deprivation was experienced both in the cities and the country, but it was perhaps in the rural communities that the poverty and the breakdown of social bonds was most keenly felt. In 1932, Franklin D. Roosevelt was elected President of the United States on the promise of what he called a New Deal. An outcome of that aspiration was the establishment of programs aimed at kickstarting the economy, and these included the establishment of what was known as the Farm Security Administration Project, and I'll refer to that through today's talk as the FSA. The FSA was principally charged to re-establish country communities by resettling people who had been forced off the land and relocating destitute city families to rural towns. And these programs were recorded by artists, writers and photographers who were in turn commissioned by the FSA. A team of photographers was established under the direction of Roy Stryker, and it was Stryker's goal to record on film as much of America as they could in terms of the people and the land. Over a 7-year period from 1935 to 1942, they produced more than 250,000 photographs. The FSA photographers were charged to gather images that were to be distributed for publication in newspapers, magazines and illustrated brochures. At its peak in 1940, the FSA was supplying more than 1,400 photographs a month to publications around the country. And this is really quite an extraordinary volume of government-commissioned and sanctioned photographs that were being published through the network of the Free Press. These photographs were used for a range of purposes. In some cases, they served to raise public awareness of the tragedy facing literally millions of Americans. However, later images functioned to show the positive outcomes of government programs. Now, at the time, the notion that this was propaganda was not terribly widely acknowledged. And this has been explained because the US government feared socialist connotations at the time and abstained from calling their efforts propaganda, preferring instead to use the word publicity. Publicity or propaganda, the results stand today as an extraordinary social document and a moving portrait of a time and place. Over the 7 years that it was in operation, the FSA employed 11 photographers, only 2 of whom were women, Dorothea Lange and Marion Post Wollcott. Dorothea Lange was born in Hoboken, New Jersey in 1895. In 1900, after her father walked away from the family, Lange, her younger brother and mother moved to New York, settling in the Lower East Side. She attended Wadley High School for Girls, which was the first public secondary school for girls in New York, and went on to take classes in photography at Columbia University. In 1918, at age 23, she left New York and settled in San Francisco, where she established a portrait photography studio. Dorothea Lange was the archetypal, educated, independent, and ambitious, thoroughly modern new woman. In 1932, Lange's photography took a new direction. She moved away from the confines of the studio portrait and began to work photographing on the street, embracing a social documentary approach in many of her images. It was in 1933 that Dorothea Lange pinned the following quote by English philosopher Francis Bacon on the wall of her studio. This quote read, "The contemplation of things as they are, without error or confusion, without substitution or imposture, is in itself a nobler thing than the whole harvest of invention." This quote remained on the wall until Lange's death in 1965, and arguably it was the philosophy that underpinned her work throughout her career. In 1935, Lange was invited to join the initial cohort of photographers commissioned by the FSA. Between 36 and 39, she undertook a series of extended road trips through Arizona, New Mexico, and Southern California to document the hardships of migrant farmers who had been driven west by the twin devastation of agricultural desolation that was being experienced across other regions of the US and the financial hardship resulting from the Great Depression. So this photograph that you can see currently on the screen and the ones to follow really serve to illustrate Lange's experiences and the work she produced when she undertook these journeys. This photograph, made on one of those journeys, illustrates one of the enduring aspects of Lange's work, the powerful combination of empathy and clear-eyed observation. In this beautifully composed image, we see 2 displaced men carrying their worldly possessions up a desolate road, passing a billboard advertising the merits and pleasures of train travel. Now, Lange firmly believed that photographs and text should be presented together to amplify the messages carried in both mediums. She believed that captions fortified her photographs and that they should not only carry factual information, but should also add clues to the attitudes, relationships, and meanings that were carried there. In this work, as is the case with many of the SFA photographs, the caption, shown here as the title, really offers only minimal factual information of place and detail. However, in this photograph, Lange has ironically juxtaposed the aspiration of clean, comfortable train travel with the exhausting reality of the unemployed traversing the country in search of work. The gulf between the haves and the have-nots is clear. The opportunistic combination of image and text does in fact articulate and amplify so much about this situation. Now, this image, also known as Tracked It Out, shows the barren lines of ploughed, drought-affected earth. The introduction of mechanisation to farming, in this case the use of tractors for ploughing, had profound implications for farming families and communities. When landowning farmers started using tractors on their land, tenant farmers who had previously been the manual labour force were no longer needed. People who may have lived on the same land for generations were moved on or tracted out, as the expression went. And they joined the legions of people who took to the road in search of work and opportunity. There is such an air of desolation within this photograph. Lange's image captures a sense of loss and abandonment. And the great strength of this image, as is the case with so many of her photographs, lies in Lange's capacity to condense larger-than-life problems into the situation of individuals. In a similar way, Lange also manages to transform the individuals in her photographs into icons, emblematic of common experience. Many of her portraits of rural women present a vision that was optimistic, even utopian, not despite the frequent depictions of sadness and deprivations, but so often because of it. She showed her subjects as more complex and worthy than their living conditions. Now, this image is without doubt the most well-known photograph by Dorothea Lange and has been credited as the most widely used photograph from the entire FSA archive. In early March 1936, Dorothea Lange drove past a sign reading "Pea Pickers Camp." Driving on 20 miles down the road, Lange reconsidered the significance of the scene she had just passed and turned back to the camp when she encountered a mother and her children. Lange is believed to have taken 7 exposures of the woman, 32-year-old Florence Owens Thompson, with various combinations of her 7 children. One of these exposures, with its tight focus on Thompson's face, transforms her into a Madonna-like figure, and the photograph became an icon of the Great Depression and one of the most famous photographs in history. On March 10, 1936, 2 of Lange's photographs of this pea pickers camp were published in the San Francisco News under a headline that read, "Ragged, Hungry, Broke, Harvest Workers Live in Squalor." The photograph was accompanied by an editorial which was titled, "What Does the New Deal Mean to This Mother and Her Children?" In 1960s, Lange recounted making this photograph, saying, "I saw and approached the hungry and desperate mother as if drawn by a magnet. She said that they had been living on frozen vegetables from the surrounding field and birds that the children had killed." But more recently, Florence Thompson's children, including those seen in this photograph, objected to this apocryphal description of events that had been drawn from editorial conjecture and memories of events long past. While this photograph is quite rightly challenged as a truthful document, showing the exact circumstances of these people, this does not detract from the extraordinary power of this image that has ensured its iconic status within photography. Now, Marion Post Wollcott is the second artist that we'll look at this afternoon. Post Wollcott was born in New Jersey in 1910. She studied at New York University and then travelled to Europe, spending time in Austria with her sister Helen Post. Helen introduced her to Trude Fleischmann, a well-known portrait photographer in Vienna. Post Wollcott's experiences in Europe were formative. Not only did she learn about photography, but she became interested in politics and activism, and this influenced her approach to making photographs. Marion Post Wollcott returned to New York in 1934. Shortly after arriving home, she began attending lectures and classes at the Photo League, where she honed her skills as a documentary photographer and developed a deep-seated belief in the capacity of photography to make a difference. It was also around this time that Post Wollcott's professional career in photography began. She worked initially as a freelance photographer for various magazines and newspapers, but was frustrated by the fact that, as a woman, her assignments were generally restricted to covering fashion and society events. Now, while studying at the Photo League, she met photographer Ralph Steiner, and he facilitated an introduction to Roy Stryker at the FSA. And so it came to pass that in 1938, Marion Post Wollcott became the second woman to join the team of photographers at the FSA. In an interview in 1965, she said, "As an FSA photographer, I was committed to changing the attitudes of people by familiarising America with the plight of the underprivileged, especially in rural America. FSA photographs shocked and aroused public opinion to increase support for the New Deal policies and projects and played an important part in the social revolution of the 30s. Between 1938 and the end of the SFA project in 1942, Post Wollcott spent a great deal of time on the road, travelling around the southern states of America. She had to struggle against misogyny and limited expectations of what women could and should do. Reflecting back on this in 1965, she said, "Well, they certainly were suspicious, very often about my travelling alone and staying in motels or rooming houses and that kind of thing, or wandering about at night. There were a lot of places I couldn't go into because I was a woman. I think that most people feel or felt at that time that it was a man's field and that a man would just automatically do a better job or be better equipped to do it. And clearly this is not the case." Having lived in New York most of her life, Marion Post Wollcott found the scenes of rural poverty quite confronting. Her work served to share people's circumstances with an audience who often had no first-hand experience of it. By the time she joined the FSA team, the direction of the project had begun to shift to a degree, and photographers were also being commissioned not only to photograph rural poverty, but to show some of the positive outcomes of the program, and in turn create an aspirational picture of Middle America. Marion Post Wollcott's photograph of the snow-covered main street of a small town is an example of a picture of hope, and it shows the direction of the organisation and the government by this time. It suggests a place where there is reasonable prosperity, streets are well lit, and at least on this one frozen night, no one is homeless. Beyond these familiar street scenes, by the late 1930s, the FSA briefs to photographers often included questions such as, how do people spend their evenings? For Marion Post Wollcott, this kind of brief enabled her to extend beyond documentary images of places, and she brought a sensitive humanist approach to her photographs of people. As we have seen, her photographs show scenes of loss and hope, tragedy, and in this example, celebration. Marion Post Wollcott's advice to other photographers was to speak with your images from your heart and soul, give of yourselves, trust your gut reactions, suck out the juices, the essence of your life experiences. Get on with it. It may not be too late. And that seems like fitting advice and a fine note on which to end this brief introduction to the work of these two major women artists. Thank you for joining me for this introductory presentation on the women photographers of the Farm Security Administration project. And I hope you can join us for further presentations on the photography collection. We look forward to seeing you back in the gallery soon. Thank you.